Continuing my read-through of the Bible, I now come to the second book of Maccabees. Now, there is a lot of interesting stuff to talk about in the second book of Maccabees, and we'll see how far I get. I'm under the same constraint that I'm always under, which is that the video camera I'm using has a file size limit of 30 minutes. So after 30 minutes, I automatically get shut off, and whatever I don't get to after 30 minutes, I just don't get to. So hopefully I'll get to talk about most of the stuff in this book. I would not be surprised if I ran out of time before I get to talk about everything, but let's jump into it and talk about this. So the second book of Maccabees is another part of what Protestants call the Apocrypha. So these were books that were in the Catholic Bible and the Eastern Orthodox Bible, but which got removed by Protestants during the Reformation. Because I grew up Protestant, I did not read the second book of Maccabees when I was growing up, so this is my first time reading the second book of Maccabees, and I'm approaching all of this as a newbie. I've done a little bit of research on Wikipedia, the internet, etc., but this is my first time reading it through. Let's talk about the connection with First Maccabees. So the second book of Maccabees is actually a completely separate work than First Maccabees. I always thought that there was a continuation of First Maccabees because all the other first, second pairs in the Old Testament are like that. So 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, 1st, 2nd Chronicles, those are all one long book that was later broken into two books just for convenience reasons. Like, it was too long to put on one scroll in the ancient world, so they put it onto two scrolls. But they're all essentially just one long book. But in 1st and 2nd Maccabees, it's a different case. These are completely different books by different authors, treating similar subjects but with a different approach. So these were both put into the Septuagint, which was the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And this was called the Book of 2nd Maccabees by whoever put the Septuagint together, just to distinguish it from the other book talking about Maccabees. So it's like the first book talking about the Maccabees, and then this other book talking about the Maccabees. So this actually covers some of the same ground that's in First Maccabees, but it's from a little bit of a different perspective. The narrator has some different concerns. And as always, when there are two books covering the same thing in the Bible, there are some contradictions. Now, I'm not going to be able to thoroughly talk about all the contradictions between 1st and 2nd Maccabees, or all the things that don't contradict each other, all the things that line up, because like I said, it's my first time reading through this, and I did read 1st Maccabees prior to reading 2nd Maccabees, but I don't hold it all in my active memory. So in order to keep track of the differences between them, I'd have had to constantly go back and check with 1st Maccabees, and I decided I'm not going to do that. This is a casual read-through of the Bible. I'm not going to try and catch every last detail. The footnotes here in the Jerusalem Bible do catch some of the differences. For example, here's a footnote in 5a. The author dates this event in 168, but 1st Maccabees should preferably be followed. So in other words, there's a discrepancy here between the two books. 1st Maccabees is probably the historically correct one, according to this footnote, etc. And there's a handful of other footnotes in here. But aside from things that jump out at me, again, I'm not going to do a thorough compare and contrast with 1st and 2nd Maccabees. The other interesting thing about 2nd Maccabees, there's a few more interesting things, but one more interesting thing is that this is a book that the Protestants had a lot of theological problems with, and a book that some of the Catholic doctrines appear to have originated from. So I've mentioned in previous reviews that my general impression when it comes to the books of the Apocrypha, the books that were in the Catholic Bible but rejected by the Protestants, is that the Protestants rejected these books as a group for a couple of general reasons. One is because we only had the Greek translations of them. There were no Hebrew originals, at least not at the time of the Protestant Reformation. And two, the Judaism did not accept these books as canonical, and the Protestants wanted to follow the Hebrew canon. And then thirdly, none of these books were quoted as being authoritative in the New Testament. Catholics would dispute this, but there don't seem to be at least any obvious quotations from the books of the Apocrypha. But as I've said in a couple previous videos, my impression is that in addition to being collectively rejected, the Protestants also had theological issues with each book specifically. Now, you always have to take me with a grain of salt because I'm not a scholar and I don't always know what I'm talking about. And I might be wrong on this, especially when it comes to all the books of the Apocrypha. Maybe Protestants didn't have a problem with them all individually. But, Second Maccabees, they definitely had some problems with. So, while I'm on the subject, why don't I go through these just briefly. The first problem is that the compiler's preface makes it clear that he's abridging a larger work. So there's a larger history on the Maccabean rebellion that apparently is intimidating in its length. He wants to create an abridgment for general enjoyment. So this obviously, Martin Luther and the Protestants thought created some problems with divine inspiration. Like, what is this? Did God inspire the original? If so, why don't we still have the original? The original has been lost to history. And did God inspire the abridgment? And that's a bit odd, isn't it? The other thing, which I didn't see this written in so many words, but I can easily imagine, the compiler is a little bit too humble. So he's kind of saying here, I tried really hard to make something enjoyable for you. I hope you like it. And then he says, okay, well, let's begin our narrative without adding any more to what has been said above. There would be no sense in expanding the preface to the history and curtailing the history itself. So he's saying, okay, I don't want to ramble on too long with the preface, lest I bore you here. And then at the end of Second Maccabees, there's another little interesting note here. He says, I shall bring my work to an end here too. If it is well composed and to the point, that is just what I wanted. If it is trashy and mediocre, that is all I could manage. So an interesting little note of humility here on the part of the compiler, which you don't usually see in books of the Bible, and which again doesn't seem to square with divine inspiration, right? If a book is divinely inspired, you're like, this is from God. You're not like, well, I hope you like it. It's the best I could do. So if you don't like it, I'm sorry. It was all I could do. You can't really put that next to like, these are books inspired by God and breathed by God and stuff like that. It's a bit of an odd preface for that. Excuse me, I'm still getting over this cough a little bit. But while I'm at it, let me quickly just jump to the other things that Protestants found problematic, even though that involves jumping forward in the book a little bit. So there's a part when a number of Jewish warriors are killed. According to the theology of Second Maccabees, and the theology in Second Maccabees is a little bit more important than the theology in First Maccabees. There's a general sense that, more so in Second Maccabees, if God is with you, you're not going to lose the battle. In First Maccabees, they won some battles and they lost some battles. But in Second Maccabees, you're not going to lose a battle unless there's a reason for God to turn against you. So a number of Jews had lost their lives after the battle, And they go to bury them, and then they found out why they had lost their lives, why God had allowed them to die. So under their tunics, amulets of idol taken from Jamnia, which the law prohibits to Jews. So they had idols in their clothes. So it became clear to everyone that this was why these men had lost their lives. Okay, so they've lost their lives, and even worse, they've lost their lives because of something sinful they've done. So this maybe puts their immortal souls in danger. So in order to help their souls get into heaven, they took up a collection, 2,000 drachmae, and sent it to Jerusalem to have a sacrifice for sin offered. And then they had a sacrifice, and they would pray for the dead. So this is apparently one of the roots of the Catholic practices of indulgence and, collecting money to have sins forgiven and praying for the souls of the dead, which was doctrines the Protestants did not like. Martin Luther apparently was very anti-Second Maccabees, and so this is one of the reasons why this book had to go from the Protestant Bibles. Excuse me. One day I'll be free of this cough, but still, it's still got me today. The other thing that Protestants found objectionable is in chapter 15, Judas Maccabees has a dream in which there are two dead holy people. Ananias, who was the high priest at the beginning of the story in 2 Maccabees, and Jeremiah, of course, from from elsewhere in the Old Testament. And in this dream, Ananias, who is already dead, was stretching out his hands and praying for the whole nation of the Jews. So apparently this is one of the bases for the Catholic doctrine of the intercession of the saints. So, the saints, even though they're already dead, they're in this special place where they can intercede between you and God by praying for you. Trying to drink some water, see if that makes the cough go away a bit. So those are all the reasons why Protestants don't like this book and why this book was kicked out of Protestant Bibles. Okay. Now, to come back to this, it starts off with a few different prefaces. It's one of these books that takes a while to actually get started. So there's actually some letters to the Jews of Egypt. And according to Wikipedia, it's believed that 2 Maccabees was actually written by a Jew living in Egypt. So I guess, he maybe collected these letters from the Jews that were in Jerusalem. So there's a first letter, a second letter. There's some interesting stories here. One about Jeremiah. Jeremiah conceals the tabernacle, ark, and altar. Now, as pointed out in the footnotes of the Jerusalem Bible, this story doesn't actually appear elsewhere in the Old Testament. And in fact, despite the fact that in this story Jeremiah wants to conceal the tabernacle, ark, and altar, the historical Jeremiah actually didn't seem that concerned that these things were going to be lost. He prophesied that they were going to be lost. Excuse me. And he just said, he didn't seem to be that concerned with preserving it. He had a fatalistic attitude to the fact that they were going to be lost. They give the Jeremiah 3:16 here as a reference, and I actually looked that up, and it does pretty much say what I just summarized as. And then there's talk about Nehemiah's library, which is also, as the footnote notes, This appears to be an uncanonical book. This isn't mentioned in the Ezra Nehemiah. So I guess we've got two references to apocryphal stories about Ezra and Nehemiah. And then the compiler's preface, which I mentioned earlier. And then we finally get into the story proper, beginning in chapter 3. All right, I'm going to pop a cough drop here, see if this helps me get through the video. This cough, it's been interfering with my videos all week, but what can you do? It's cold season. So the story of 2nd Maccabees starts earlier than 1st Maccabees. So 2nd Maccabees starts with Heliodorus, who was the successor of Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus Epiphanes is like the really big, bad ruler who starts out the Jewish rebellion, or who inspires the Jewish rebellion. But in 2nd Maccabees, we actually start with Heliodorus, who has it in mind to tax the temple. But then when he gets to the temple, there's a miracle. So he's going in to tax the temple, but before their eyes, a horse, richly caparisoned and carrying a fearsome rider, rearing violently, it struck at Heliodorus with its forefeet. The rider was seen to be accoutrements entirely in gold. 2 other young men of outstanding strength and radiant beauty, magnificently apparelled, appeared to him at the same time, and taking their stand on either side of him, flogged him unremittingly, inflicting stroke after stroke. So as Heliodorus is attempting to go into the temple, this, vision of a fearsome rider on a horse, some sort of angelic angel of retribution, appears and just starts flogging him. And these kind of fantastical miracles were not really a big part of 1st Maccabees, but they're all throughout 2nd Maccabees. 2nd Maccabees is very dramatic in that way, and it has a lot of big visions of divine intervention and angelic and divine beings coming into the field of battle and stuff like that. It's a lot more, what's the word I want to use? It's a lot more melodramatic than 1st Maccabees, and a lot more entertaining. Now, the other thing that we get in 2nd Maccabees that we don't get in 1st Maccabees is we get some insight into the machinations of the people who want to become high priests of the temple. So there's Onias. This is a guy I mentioned at the who appears in the dream sequence at the end of 2nd Maccabees. He is the original high priest. He's the really good and holy guy. But other people want to be the high priest, so they get involved in bribing and spreading rumors. And so then Jason becomes the high priest and introduces Hellenism. And then Jason gets pushed out by Menelaus, who becomes a high priest. And then Onias gets murdered. So in 2nd Maccabees, we get treated to more the story of the power struggle within the Jewish community to become the high priest, which is how, according to this narrative, Antiochus Epiphanes gets involved in the Jewish worship in the first place. And then once Antiochus Epiphanes comes in and does all the sacrilegious stuff he does. I almost forgot. We get to the martyrdoms. So I mentioned in my discussion on 1st Maccabees that 1st Maccabees is viewed as kind of taking a dim view of martyrs. Or maybe dim is too strong a word, but the idea is like, okay, you can be a martyr if you want to, but it's better to actually fight back than to passively be slaughtered. But Second Maccabees has some stories about Jewish martyrs who are killed from their faith, and again, very melodramatic ways. I don't even have to check the sources to be relatively sure that this is almost certainly fictional. So there's the martyrdom of Eliezer, who's 90 years old and one of the teachers of the law, but refuses to eat pork, so he gets killed for that. And then there's the martyrdom of 7 brothers, who are all killed by Antiochus Epiphanes, one after the other, in rather dramatic ways. So the king, in a fury, ordered pans and cauldrons to be heated over a fire. As soon as they were red hot, he commanded that his spokesman of theirs should have his tongue cut out, his head scalped, and his extremities cut off, while the other brothers and his mother looked on. So the first one has his tongue cut out, but not the other ones. The others are able to talk and to refuse to submit to Antiochus Epiphanes, even as they're being boiled alive on these cauldrons, or having their extremities cut off. It's something that I should have mentioned earlier when I was talking about the prayers for the dead. I guess as you may know, in Judaism of around the time of Christ, not all Jews believed in the resurrection of the dead. The Pharisees did, but the Sadducees did not. Second Maccabees clearly believes in the resurrection of the dead. In fact, when they're praying for the dead, it even makes a little point of mentioning that. Says, for if he had not expected the fallen to rise again, it would have been superfluous and foolish to pray for the dead. So in other words, obviously he thinks the dead are going to rise again. Otherwise, why would he be praying for them? Duh. And here, when the 7 brothers are being martyred, their mother is urging them to keep to their faith even as they're being martyred, because the belief that God is going to resurrect you again. Now, as someone who considers himself an agnostic, I guess I have the view of the resurrection of the dead that all agnostics have, which is doesn't really seem to be any proof that this is possible. But there's some philosophizing going on here, maybe. An argument in favor of the resurrection of the dead. So the mother says, I do not know how you appeared in my womb. It was not I who endowed you with life, breath, and life. I had not the shaping of your every part. It is the creator of the world, ordaining the process of man's birth and presiding over the origin of all things, who in his mercy will most surely give you back both breath and life. In other words, and I believe this is maybe even stated a little bit more clearly elsewhere in this book, God was able to create you and give you life in the first place. He must surely have the power to recreate you and, recreate your body and recreate your consciousness after you die. And, maybe there's something to that. I know nowadays we take a materialistic view of things and believe that we're just collections of atoms and stuff like that. But you know what? I'm not going to get sidetracked down this philosophical rabbit hole at the moment. I've got a lot more text to cover. So let's go to Judas Maccabees and the resistance. So I mentioned that I wasn't going to point out all the differences between First Maccabees and Second Maccabees. But I think a big difference, which you can't help but notice even as a casual reader, is in First Maccabees, the revolt was started not by Judas Maccabees, but by Judas Maccabees' father, Matthias. And after Matthias dies, then the revolt, the leadership of the revolt, gets passed to first Judas Maccabees and then his brother. In Second Maccabees, there's no Matthias. We just start right in with Judas Maccabees. So no mention of the mention of his brothers, but no mention of his father. Now, while we're here, 2 Maccabees 8, there's an interesting little passage in 2 Maccabees 8, which I had me scratching my head a little bit. See what you make about it. So he's talking about, the enemy army is much larger than the Jewish army. Second Maccabees, Judas Maccabees is giving them a little pep talk about how size doesn't matter, because there's plenty of times in history when God has helped the Jewish people against a larger force. So he mentions the time with Sennacherib. That one's in 2 Kings. But then there's also another one. That time in Babylonia, when in the battle with the Galatians, the Jewish combatants numbered only 8,000 and 4,000 Macedonians. Yet when the Macedonians were hard pressed, the 8,000 wiped out 120,000 because of the help they received from heaven and won incalculable gains. So, what is this referencing here? There was a time in Babylonia? So this was when the Jews were in Babylon? Was there a time when the Jews were in Babylon when they were fighting with the Galatians in Babylonia? I actually looked this up on Google and didn't find much on the Google search. I'm sure there's got to be commentary about this out there somewhere. Maybe if I had stuck with it a little bit more, but didn't find anything on the first Google search. Anyways, if anybody has any idea what that's talking about, let me know. Yeah, the other thing, I mentioned there were a lot more miracles happening in the book of 2 Maccabees. Let me see if I can find a good one here. There's one. Oh yeah, here they go. This is from 2 Maccabees 10. They're in another battle. When the battle was at its height, the enemy saw 5 magnificent men appear from heaven on horses with golden bridles, and put themselves at the head of the Jews, surrounding Maccabees and screening him with their own armor. They kept him unscathed, while they rained arrows and thunderbolts on the enemy, until blinded and confused, they scattered in complete disorder. So, I guess with all these picturesque miracles or supernatural events, it comes as no surprise probably when Wikipedia mentions that 2 Maccabees has had a big influence on Christian art over the centuries. And in fact, I forgot to mention this earlier, but the martyrdom of 7 brothers, where they're all being boiled alive for their martyrdom, this was also a popular subject of Christian art during the medieval period, apparently. So with all these very melodramatic scenes and miracles and stuff like that, you easily get the impression, even as a casual reader, that 2 Maccabees probably isn't that reliable as a historical source. And sure enough, according to Wikipedia, that has generally been the perception throughout the ages. Although Wikipedia does say that, I guess, in the 20th century, there was more of a movement to recognize that some of this might be historically accurate, some of it, even though it comes from a source that's actually biased with religion and with religious miracles. That doesn't actually mean there might not be some historical nuggets in here. I'm out of time, so I'm going to have to stop it here. I've said most of what I wanted to say. I'm just going to have to call it good here.